We have had episodes of reform and faster economic growth that were not merely a function of the price of oil, but we were unable to consolidate and build on them. And millions, indeed scores of millions of our compatriots have paid the price in terms of diminished job prospects and human well-being. For example, in the decade between 2000 and 2014, we had an average GDP growth rate of 3.84%, well above our population growth rate of 2.6% per annum, meaning that people were on average truly improving their standards of living. During the following decade, average annual GDP per capita growth has been negative, around minus 0.9%, meaning people were worse off because we were not able to sustain prior positive growth momentum. A very important part of the explanation for why we've not been able to succeed is lack of policy consistency. Successive administrations failing to continue good, and I emphasize good, economic and social policies put in place by predecessors, allowing politics to frame policy, what we can call the not made in my administration syndrome. We all understand that where policies are bad and not working, of course, politics should intervene. But where things are working to the good, we ask, why fix what is not broken? To minimize the volatility of economic and social policy, and to set our country on a steady growth and development path, rather than an episodic growth path, I have become increasingly convinced that Nigeria needs a social contract. By this I mean a fundamental cross-party, cross-society agreement that certain things in the economy, in the country, in policy and in society are sacrosanct and shall not be touched or changed when administrations change. And the private sector and Nigeria's civil society, including influential actors like the NBA, have important roles to play in policing a social contract and holding the political class accountable. The idea of a social contract dates back at least a few centuries when philosophers such as Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes spelled out the notion of a compact, formal or implicit, defining the rights and duties of rulers and the ruled. A more focused definition for our purposes comes from the former head of the London School of Economics and the former president of Columbia University, my former World Bank colleague, Minu Shafiq. She describes the social contract as being about how we pool our resources to provide the public goods we agree are needed, and how we support those affected by adverse shocks. Her book, What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract for a Better Society, argues that in our fast-changing globalized economy, we need a new social contract to create a sense of security among people. What I'm calling for here is even more basic. I'm saying that all major actors in the governance of our country should agree on some basic parameters for security, macroeconomic and social stability, and the enabling environment for future dynamism and growth of our country. Once agreed, these parameters and policies should be institutionalized or enshrined in law, or even be made part of our constitution, not to be tampered with, except perhaps through a national referendum involving the entire country and society. My convictions on Nigeria's need for a social contract were reinforced recently when I was in Peru on an official visit. Looking at the country as a Nigerian, I was struck by the mismatch between its politics and its economic performance. Politics in Peru has been and is extremely messy and toxic. The country has had 6 presidents in the past 7 years. The current president took office amid violent protests after her predecessor was arrested and jailed for attempting to dissolve Congress and rule by decree. The government and opposition are constantly at each other's throats, with regular impeachment proceedings and frequent social unrest. You would think that a country with such messy politics would be an economic laggard at best, or economic disaster at worst. But to my shock, when I looked at the numbers, it was not. I mentioned earlier how Peru's per capita GDP is now almost 5 times higher than ours, even though we were roughly even in the 1980s. According to IMF numbers, Peru's modest GDP growth rates of 2.5 to 2.7% over the last couple of years is coupled with very good macroeconomic indicators. Its current account deficit is a modest 1.1% of GDP. Its fiscal deficit is 2.5% of GDP, below the recommended 3%, and its debt to GDP ratio is 33%. According to data from its central bank, Peru's foreign exchange reserves as of this month are at 77.4 billion, most of them usable reserves, and inflation is 2%.